The moment I saw her in the mirror, my breath caught, sharp and unsteady, like I had stumbled into someone else's life by accident, or perhaps by fate. The reflection was familiar and strange all at once. Soft, delicate features that seemed almost like a dream, a face I had carried in secret for years, finally given space to exist in the light. My hands hovered over my cheeks, over the subtle curve of my lips, over the gentle sweep of my lashes, trembling as though touching this version of myself might shatter it. Yet the hands belonged to me, and so did every fragile line of this new reality. It had begun months ago, quietly, almost innocuously. At first, it was the thrill of a scarf slipping around my neck, the unexpected joy of the soft caress of fabric I had never allowed myself to feel. Then came the clothes, the makeup, the little explorations that I told myself were experiments, though in my heart they were confessions. Every brush of color against my skin, every whisper of silk and lace, felt like reclaiming something I had lost before I even knew it existed. Standing here now, in a dress that hugged my body in ways that felt both foreign and inevitable, I realized that this wasn't just curiosity. This was me, finally finding form in the world outside the mind. The process had been messy, emotional, terrifying. Each stroke of lipstick was a negotiation with my own fear, a declaration that I would no longer hide. Each time I caught my reflection, I saw not just a costume, but an identity that had been quietly demanding acknowledgement, an echo of myself that I had silenced for years with clothes, routines, and a life that felt prescribed. And yet, the excitement and pride were laced with doubt. Could anyone else see what I saw? Could anyone recognize the truth behind the carefully applied blush, the mascara, the soft sweep of a skirt that had taken courage to choose? My partner's presence in the doorway steadied me, a warm, quiet reminder that I wasn't alone. Their smile, patient and encouraging, made my chest ache. "You're ready," they said, and the simplicity of the words hit me with the weight of a lifetime. Ready? Was I truly ready to step into a world that might not understand me? Ready to let people see this version of myself I had nurtured in secret for so long? Fear clawed at my stomach, whispering all the reasons to turn back, to hide behind the identity that had been safe for decades. And yet, even as the nerves burned through me, there was exhilaration, the sort of wild, dizzying thrill that comes only when stepping into the truth of your own being. The dress felt alive against my skin, a second skin that was at once alien and entirely mine. I twirled, cautiously at first, then with more abandon, and the motion made the room feel charged, electric, as if it knew this was the moment of transformation. My hair fell softly around my shoulders, framing the face I had spent years imagining, now fully real. Every detail, from the delicate earrings my partner had picked out to the careful choice of shoes that made me feel tall and graceful, added layers to the story I was about to tell the world with my presence alone. The date ahead loomed like a precipice. I felt the weight of anticipation pressing against my chest, the tension of uncertainty that came with being truly visible. Would my voice sound right? Would my mannerisms betray me? Would anyone see her and recognize that she had been there all along, waiting quietly for permission to emerge? My mind raced, circling doubts, fears, and hope in a way that made it hard to breathe. Yet through it all, there was clarity too. The real change wasn't in the dress, or the hair, or the makeup. It was in me. Standing here, trembling and alive, I realized I was no longer hiding. I was stepping fully into the fragile, exhilarating, undeniable truth of who I had always been. The city outside seemed both familiar and entirely new, as if the streets themselves were holding their breath, waiting for me to take this step. The air smelled of crisp winter leaves and distant streetlights, and with each step toward the car, my reflection in the shop windows mirrored a version of me I had barely dared to dream about. Every passing pedestrian felt like a subtle test, a question. Would they see me as her, or would the past cling invisibly to my silhouette, betraying the years I had spent hiding? My pulse quickened, a relentless drum that echoed the uncertainty gnawing at my chest, yet I moved forward, hand lightly gripping the door handle, my reflection trembling alongside me. Sitting in the car, I caught a glimpse of myself in the rearview mirror. The image made my stomach twist with a combination of pride and terror. My eyes seemed larger somehow, framed by the mascara and liner that I had painstakingly applied, and my lips, the color of soft rose petals, carried a confidence I didn't entirely feel yet. My partner reached over, fingers brushing lightly against mine, grounding me. Their touch was quiet reassurance, a lifeline as my mind raced through every possible scenario. What if I stumbled over words? What if a glance, a smile, a laugh revealed the years I had worn a different mask? Yet with that touch came courage. I wasn't pretending anymore. Every inch of me, every gesture, every careful line of makeup was proof that I was finally allowed to exist fully. The drive to the restaurant felt interminable. Streetlights stretched past us like slow-moving witnesses, shadows flickering over the contours of my face. I kept my hands folded in my lap, trying to anchor myself, yet they trembled slightly, betraying the storm within. I whispered apologies to my own reflection, silent murmurs of reassurance. "You're okay. You're ready. You can do this." My partner's voice, soft and warm, broke through the tension, guiding me back to the present, reminding me that this moment was meant to be savored, not feared. When we arrived, the valet looked at me for a split second longer than expected. That brief hesitation made my chest tighten. I felt the familiar claws of anxiety reaching for me, but I forced a smile, a small, practiced curve of lips that felt like armor. Stepping out of the car, I caught the subtle sway of the dress, the gentle clink of earrings, the careful elegance I had cultivated. With each step toward the entrance, I reminded myself, the world was not a mirror. It did not owe me recognition. I owed it to myself. To her. Inside, the warm glow of lights and soft hum of conversation wrapped around me like a protective cocoon. We were seated at a quiet corner table, away from the casual scrutiny of other diners, yet even there, I felt exposed, acutely aware of the rhythm of my own breathing. My partner reached across the table, fingers brushing mine again, and I let myself anchor there, allowing a tiny surge of courage to bloom. Conversation began, hesitant at first, my voice higher than I had imagined, soft, tentative, but natural, authentic, undeniably me. And with every word, every glance, every shared laugh, the fear that had threatened to paralyze me began to soften. I was becoming accustomed to being seen, not just tolerated, not just disguised, but fully recognized. And then a flicker of doubt returned, as unexpected as a shadow in sunlight. The waiter's glance lingered too long, a slight curve of a smile I couldn't read, and a flush of insecurity rose in my chest. For a moment, I felt like stepping back into the familiar, the safe, the hidden version of myself. But even in that flicker, I caught my own eyes in the reflection of a nearby window, and I saw not a man in disguise, but a woman embracing her own existence. The anxiety still lingered, but the truth was undeniable. I was here, alive, visible, and I was beginning to understand what it meant to belong to myself. Sitting there, across from the one person who had witnessed both the man I had been and the woman I was becoming, I felt the full weight of the moment pressing down on me. The restaurant buzzed with life around us, soft laughter, the clinking of glasses, the gentle scrape of silverware, but all of it seemed to exist in a parallel world, separate from the fragile, pulsing reality that I carried in my chest. Every sound was amplified, every glance at the table a potential reflection of judgment. And yet, beneath the anxiety, there was a strange, soaring clarity. I was here. I was visible. I was real. The conversation started cautiously, tentative as if my voice itself needed time to recognize the room. My partner spoke first, the warmth in their tone acting as a bridge to the outside world. And slowly, the words began to flow from me, hesitant at first, then gaining weight and confidence with each passing minute. I laughed, and it sounded like someone I had always imagined I could be. I smiled, and it was no longer a shadow of the man I had been, but a light that belonged to her. Each sentence I spoke carried a risk, yes, but also a liberation I had never known. I had spent decades negotiating the world on someone else's terms, hiding behind a carefully constructed mask, and now that mask was gone. And yet, the fear refused to disappear completely. Every glance from the staff, every subtle movement from other diners, made me wonder if I was being found out, if the delicate illusion of normalcy would shatter in an instant. My heart thudded violently at moments when a waiter lingered, or when a voice from a nearby table carried across the air like an unwelcome question. I realized in a flash that this wasn't just about how others saw me, it was about how I saw myself. Could I trust that she, the woman I had nurtured in secret for so long, was deserving of space in the world? Could I finally believe that the person reflected in the mirror was not a fleeting fantasy, but a truth I could carry with me wherever I went? The conversation shifted to lighter topics, and for a fleeting moment, I let myself forget the trembling in my hands, the tightening in my chest. We talked about movies, about the small absurdities of work, about memories that stretched back into the shadows of my old life. My partner laughed, and I realized I had never felt that level of ease in a decade or more. The laughter felt like sunlight spilling into a locked room. But even in that warmth, a subtle tension lingered, a sense that any misstep could unravel the fragile sense of belonging I was just beginning to feel. Every movement, every tilt of my head, every gentle brush of hair from my face felt charged with significance. I wasn't just eating dinner. I was performing a delicate dance of existence, one that had taken years of hidden practice and courage to arrive at this point. At one moment, I caught my reflection in the window beside our table, illuminated by the soft glow of streetlights and neon signs. I looked almost ethereal, the dress flowing around me like water, my hair catching the light in soft waves. But the eyes were what struck me hardest. They were my eyes, the same that had stared back at me through decades of doubt, of self-denial, yet now they held a quiet defiance, a flicker of triumph. I blinked, and the reflection seemed to nod, silently acknowledging the journey it had endured, the countless small rebellions, the whispered confessions, the private nights of trembling hope. That reflection, fragile and radiant, was no longer a stranger. She was me wholly, undeniably. And yet, the world intruded in subtle, almost cruel ways. A waiter, bustling past with a tray of glasses, gave a fleeting glance that felt loaded with unspoken questions. A group of diners laughed nearby, their eyes catching mine for a split second, and in that moment, the old anxiety surged like a tidal wave. My stomach knotted, and I felt the familiar, irrational desire to shrink, to retreat into a shell I hadn't occupied for years. But then, almost imperceptibly, I felt my partner's hand on mine, grounding me, and I remembered the quiet, persistent truth I had learned in front of the mirror, that I was allowed to exist. That she, the woman I had always longed to become, had a right to the air I breathed, to the space I occupied, to the light of the world outside my apartment. I took a deep breath, letting the tension seep from my shoulders, though the tremor in my hands lingered. The date continued, a delicate balance between normalcy and revelation. I told stories, shared thoughts, laughed, and occasionally faltered, my voice cracking or rising in pitch, and each moment of imperfection felt like a tiny victory. I was being seen, fully, without apology. And with each passing second, the fear that had threatened to paralyze me began to transform. It became a companion, a reminder of the gravity of what I was doing, of the courage it took to step fully into the truth of my own existence. By the time dessert arrived, the trembling had eased, replaced by a quiet, luminous confidence that I had never known. I caught myself in the reflective surface of a water glass, and for a long moment, I simply stared. The woman in the reflection smiled at me, and I returned it without hesitation. She was real. I was real. And the world, in all its chaos and unpredictability, was not going to erase the truth I had claimed for myself. The walk back from the restaurant felt like crossing a tightrope stretched thin over a city that didn't know I existed. The night air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain and exhaust, every footstep echoing with a mixture of exhilaration and fear. I could feel the eyes of the city pressing against me, even if no one truly was looking. The dress swayed with every step, a silent declaration, and my hair brushed my shoulders in waves that made my own heartbeat seem almost audible. My hands kept fidgeting, adjusting the hem, the clutch, the invisible boundaries I had set around myself. Each movement was a subtle negotiation with reality. I was here, I was her, and yet the world might not be ready to recognize either. The streets were alive with people moving in clusters and pairs, their laughter and conversation a reminder of normalcy I had always felt excluded from. I noticed a group of teenagers walking past, their casual glances slicing through me like sharp light. For a moment, I froze, imagining all the judgments that could be there, all the questions that might hang unspoken in the air. My chest tightened, breath catching, and I could feel my pulse in my ears. The instinct to shrink, to vanish, clawed at me, a reflex honed by decades of self-consciousness and hiding. But as I looked at my partner's steady gaze beside me, I realized that retreating was no longer an option. The risk of being fully seen had become worth the tremor in my bones. We paused on the corner to wait for the light, and in that suspended moment, I caught my reflection in a polished window, framed by the flickering neon of a nearby cafe. She was there, every nuance of her existence laid bare in the darkened glass. The soft curve of the jaw, the delicate arch of the brows, the faint blush on the cheeks, the confident tilt of the head. And yet, within that reflection, there was tension. A subtle fear that the city, the night, and the people moving past would reject her, would insist on the him I had carried before. I gripped my partner's hand tightly, seeking the reassurance that had carried me this far, and felt a small, surging spark of courage. If I could survive the mirror, if I could survive my own judgment, perhaps the world could survive me too. A sudden gust of wind lifted strands of hair into my face, and I laughed nervously, brushing them aside, trying to anchor myself. It was a ridiculous, intimate moment. My reflection fractured across a dozen shards of glass, each piece reflecting a slightly different version of me, and yet it felt cinematic, as if the city itself was acknowledging my existence in fragments before I could step fully into my whole. I felt my pulse settle, just slightly, as I realized the most terrifying moments were also the most liberating. Every flutter of anxiety, every flush of uncertainty, was proof that I was finally alive, finally stretching into a form I had dreamed about for years. When we reached the small park where we had parked the car, the shadows deepened, and the world seemed quieter, stripped of the distractions of the bustling streets. I sank onto a bench, still fully aware of the night's gaze, but letting the tension in my body ebb just enough to feel my own heartbeat, my own breath, my own presence. My partner sat beside me, their shoulder brushing mine in silent comfort. Words were unnecessary. We simply existed together in that fragile equilibrium. Two people, one of whom had finally crossed the threshold from hiding to being. I looked up at the night sky, searching for a sense of permanence in the shifting constellations, wondering how much of identity is internal and how much belongs to the outside world's recognition. My mind wandered through memories of past failures, the social anxiety that had kept me in shadows, the years of performing a role that never fit. And then, like a gentle tide, gratitude washed over me. For the first time in decades, I felt fully owned by my own skin, fully claimed by the identity I had nurtured in secret. That gratitude was tinged with fear, a recognition that the road ahead would still be difficult, that not everyone would understand, and that acceptance, both internal and external, would be a continuous journey. Yet even in the tension, there was joy, raw and luminous. I could feel the elegance of the dress, the subtle sway of my posture, the small but deliberate gestures that marked my existence in a way the world had never fully seen before. The transformation was no longer cosmetic or performative, it was existential. Every fiber of me was vibrating with the knowledge that I had crossed an invisible boundary, a threshold from hiding into living. And the most extraordinary part was realizing that this boundary had never existed outside of myself. It had been a prison of fear, self-doubt, and hesitation, now left behind like an old coat I no longer needed. Hours seemed to stretch in this suspended, delicate space. The city around us blurred into motion and shadow, and yet every detail of my experience was magnified. The distant glow of street lamps, the faint rustle of leaves, the soft murmur of our conversation that had dwindled into companionable silence. I felt a profound intimacy with the air itself, as though the world had paused to witness me stepping into a truth that had been waiting patiently for decades. And somewhere deep inside, a whisper of wonder emerged. This is who you are. This is who you have always been. And she is real. The night carried a strange weight as we walked back toward the car, the city stretching endlessly around us, lights flickering like hesitant applause for a performance I wasn't sure I was ready to claim. Every step felt magnified, as though the pavement itself could sense my trepidation, each crack and uneven slab reminding me of every misstep I had ever taken in the life I had left behind. My mind, which had been quiet during the restaurant, now roared with a torrent of thoughts. What would people think if they saw me? Could I navigate the world as her and still remain accepted, still remain safe? But then, in the same breath, there was the other voice, the one I had finally allowed to speak after years of silencing, the one that whispered, persistently, beautifully, "You are here. You are real. You are allowed." My reflection in the occasional shop windows startled me. It wasn't just that I looked different, it was that I looked like someone who had emerged from a long, difficult story into the light. There was elegance in the lines of my face, confidence in the curve of my shoulders, even in the subtle sway of the dress as I walked. Yet there was also fragility, a vulnerability that hadn't left me entirely. The world outside could not see the full spectrum of what I was feeling, the joy, the fear, the relief, the apprehension all woven together into a heartbeat that felt both precarious and defiant. I clenched my clutch bag slightly, as though holding onto it would somehow anchor me to this fragile version of reality that I had built for myself. When a passerby glanced in my direction, I felt a rush of heat rise to my cheeks, the old reflex of shrinking, tugging hard at my spine. My steps faltered, and for a fleeting moment, I imagined the shadows of the past wrapping around me, the whispers of judgment echoing like ghosts. And yet, my partner's hand on mine, firm and warm, reminded me that I was not alone in this. The anxiety that had threatened to paralyze me began to transform into something else: awareness. Each nervous heartbeat became a pulse of authenticity, proof that the life I was stepping into required courage, but also promised freedom. By the time we reached the small, dimly lit bridge that crossed the river near our apartment, the world had slowed. The water below reflected the city lights in fragmented patterns, a kaleidoscope of neon and gold that seemed to mirror the complexity of my own journey. I leaned against the railing, feeling the cool metal under my fingers, and stared down at my reflection in the water. There she was again, delicate, luminous, tentative yet undeniably present. For a long moment I couldn't breathe. It was as if the river was showing me every version of myself that had existed over the years, each one layered on top of the other, converging into this single, fragile, beautiful being. The emotions hit me like a tidal wave. Relief,
fear, pride,
wonder, and beneath it all, a raw, almost shocking gratitude for the years of secrecy, for the small rebellions, for the quiet moments of self-acknowledgement that had led me here. I realized that the hardest part wasn't the dress or the makeup or the public eye. It was learning to trust that I belonged in this form, that she had a right to exist just as boldly and vulnerably as the person I had been hiding. Every step I had taken tonight had been a negotiation with that fear, every glance from strangers a subtle test of resilience. And in that moment, leaning against the railing, I felt victorious, not because the world had accepted me, but because I had accepted myself. The journey back to the car was slower, deliberate, as though each movement needed to be savored, recorded in memory. I noticed every detail: the soft hum of traffic, The faint scent of damp asphalt, the way the streetlights cast elongated shadows across the pavement. My dress swirled gently with each step, my hair catching faint glimmers of light, and I felt a strange, intoxicating mix of power and fragility. The city could see me now, and for the first time, I realized that the gaze I feared most, the one I had projected onto strangers, was not as important as the gaze I held in the mirror. It was her gaze, steady and unwavering, looking at herself and saying, "You are enough. You have always been enough." When we reached the car, I paused for a moment, gripping the door handle and inhaling deeply. The night had tested me, teased me, and pushed me to the edge of every insecurity I had carried. Yet I was still standing, still breathing, still luminous in a way that was impossible to deny. Sliding into the seat, I caught one last glimpse of the city behind me, the streets we had crossed like a silent witness to my transformation. And in that fleeting glance, I realized that this was more than a date, more than a night out. It was the first step in a life lived fully, unapologetically, as the person I had always been on the inside but never allowed the world to see. As my partner started the car and we merged into the quiet hum of nighttime traffic, I let myself exhale fully for the first time all evening. The tension that had wrapped around my chest and shoulders like chains slowly unwound, leaving behind a soft, glowing sense of possibility. I touched my face lightly, feeling the contours of the cheeks, the curve of the lips, the soft sweep of hair against my fingers. She was here, undeniably real, and the night had witnessed her birth into the world. For the first time, I felt the promise of tomorrow not as a source of anxiety, but as an open door, inviting me to walk fully into a life I had been too afraid to claim. The drive home was quiet, almost sacred, a delicate pause after the storm of emotions that had carried me through the night. Streetlights glided past in a soft blur, each one reflecting in the car window like fragments of memory, reminders of every small step, every whispered confession, every hidden longing that had led me here. I stared out at the city, the familiar streets taking on an unfamiliar intimacy, as if they now recognized me as someone wholly new yet undeniably the same. I traced my reflection in the glass, her reflection, and for the first time, I didn't flinch. She was real. I was real. And that simple acknowledgement, so long denied, felt like the deepest exhale I had ever taken. I thought back to the mirror in my apartment earlier, to the trembling hands brushing over my face, to the tentative steps in the dress, to the fragile heartbeat of someone emerging into the light. Every fear I had carried, the judgment of strangers, the disbelief of acquaintances, the ridicule I had imagined waiting in corners, had been there, yes, but it was no longer the force that controlled me. Instead, a quiet strength had taken root, a knowledge that vulnerability was not weakness, but proof of survival. The trembling in my hands had transformed into something else entirely, the pulse of a woman who had finally been allowed to step fully into her own life. Pulling into the driveway, I hesitated for a moment, fingers lingering on the door handle. The night felt heavier here, more intimate, a threshold I had crossed countless times as him, a version of myself that had been cautious, measured, unseen. But tonight, stepping out, the air felt different. Each breath I drew was lighter, freer, imbued with the knowledge that I had claimed space for myself. The dress swayed gently with emotion, the soft whisper of fabric against skin a reminder that the world, for all its indifference, could not erase what had been born in courage and persistence. Inside the apartment, the lights were dim, casting shadows that had once felt oppressive but now seemed almost protective. I moved toward the mirror in the hallway, drawn as if by gravity, heart thudding in quiet anticipation. And there she was again, fully herself, fully me, catching the light in her hair, the soft curve of her lips, the steady, confident gaze of eyes that had once been hesitant and unsure. I reached out, fingertips brushing the glass, and in that simple touch, I felt an entire lifetime of denial, doubt, and self-suppression dissolve into quiet acknowledgement. She had survived. I had survived. And the world could not take that away. Sitting down on the edge of the bed, I let myself sink into the fullness of what had happened tonight. Every laugh shared, every nervous glance overcome, every small victory in posture, voice, and movement, it all carried weight. Not the kind measured by the judgment of others, but the weight of authenticity, of truth finally realized. I realized then that transformation was never just external. It had been quiet, internal, weaving itself through years of hidden self-expression until it emerged tonight in a form the world could finally recognize. And in that recognition, in that fragile, glowing clarity, there was a profound freedom I had never known. My partner appeared behind me, silent at first, letting the room hold its own reflection before offering their gentle presence. The warmth of their hand on my shoulder, the quiet reassurance in their eyes, reminded me that love had not been a spectator tonight. It had been a guide, a witness, a companion through every hesitant step and trembling heartbeat. "You are incredible," they said softly, and it wasn't praise, it was truth, simple and undeniable. I nodded, unable to speak at first, my throat thick with the weight of emotions I had barely begun to name.
Pride.
Relief.
Awe.
Gratitude. And yes, even a flicker of disbelief that the self I had so long nurtured in secret was finally allowed to exist without apology. I rose from the bed, moving to the window, looking out at the quiet city beneath the moonlight. The streets were calm now, but the night felt infinite, as if the world itself had paused to honor the small, extraordinary act of claiming my identity. I traced the lines of my face in the reflection once more, and the faintest smile curved my lips. She was here, and she was me. The journey ahead would not be without challenge. There would be moments of doubt, stares that questioned, voices that failed to understand. But for the first time, I could meet those moments from a place of full authenticity, not shadow, not fear. I had crossed the threshold into my own life, and nothing could undo that. Finally, I sank onto the bed, letting the weight of the night settle into my bones, a quiet exhaustion that was almost sacred. The dress had been removed, the makeup still faint on my cheeks, the hair tousled by hours of movement and emotion, but none of that mattered. What mattered was her, the self I had always been, now undeniable, luminous, and alive. And as I drifted toward sleep, I carried with me the unshakable knowledge that this was only the beginning. The night had witnessed my transformation, but the real journey, the endless, beautiful journey of living fully as myself, stretched ahead like the infinite city lights beyond the window. And for the first time, I felt completely, unconditionally, irrevocably home in my own skin.